Hello everybody, welcome to this lecture on religion and politics. My name is Marek Čejka and I'm lecturing political science and international relations, especially the issues of Middle East politics in Mendel University and in Masaryk University in Brno, Czech Republic. Just very briefly about my work, here you can see some of my books. Most of them were published in Czech language and they are focused on region of Middle East, of Israeli-Palestinian conflict and so on. But there is also one which was published in 2015 in Routledge Publishing House, and together with my colleague Roman Kořan we wrote about the role of the religious authorities of Judaism in Israeli politics and about their position in Europe and in United States. Okay, so let's begin with our lecture. On this map of the world, you can see the distribution of the religion around the world. You can see the various Christian churches in the West, in Europe. In orange, it's Protestantism. In yellow color, it's Roman Catholicism. You can also look at the Americas and the religious variability of the United States. You can also see how strong is Catholicism in Latin America. You can see also Islamic world with its division of Sunni and Shia Islam. In light blue is Sunni, and in dark blue is Shia Islamic countries. You can see also the Hindu India, but there is also on this map you cannot see the religious minorities, for example, as the Indian Muslims and so on. You can see also the Buddhist parts of the Far East, Islamic Indonesia, and you can see also this dark gray fields which are showing the regions where no religion is prevailing, and this is usually on the territory of former socialist countries of the parts of the eastern, so-called Eastern Bloc in time of Cold War. So you can see the parts of the Soviet Union, you can see some Eastern European countries, you can see also Czech Republic, and you can see also the China. All of them were very strongly influenced by leftist anti-religious ideologies. In this map you can see more in detail how complicated is religious situation in Europe, which is due to the various historical events which happened on the European territory, especially, for example, the 30 Years' War and some other confessional conflicts. You can see the red color going from Spain to France, Italy, Austria to Poland and Lithuania, which are traditionally very strong Catholic countries. You can see also the blue color of Protestantism on the parts of Germany, Denmark, Scandinavia, Iceland, but also in Great Britain. And what is also interesting, you can see here the territories with more compact Muslim communities living in Europe. So you, for example, on this map you don't see the Muslim communities in Western Europe because they are distributed, especially in the big cities, but not so much in other regions of Western European countries. But in Balkans the situation is different. This territory was for a very long time under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and as it was advantageous to have the faith of your ruler. For example, if you were living in Spain, it was better for you to be Catholic. If you were living in Scandinavia, it was easier for you to be a Protestant. So of course, if you were subordinated to the Ottoman Sultan, it was advantageous for you to be a Muslim. So also many after there was a conquest of Balkans and Southern Europe by Ottoman Empire, also many Europeans converted to Islam. And still we can see in some countries like it's Bosnia, Herzegovina, Albania, partly Bulgaria. There are still very strong, compact Muslim communities for hundreds of years. In discussions in Europe and in the West, many people are now speaking about the so-called Christian civilization or even Judeo-Christian civilization and so on, and that probably they understand that all of this development of the West, that its technological advantages and so on, they are due to Christianity, which is only very partly true, because all of this contemporary political tradition, the modern ideologies, nationalisms, and so on, they are not built on the religious background, or even vice versa. They were sometimes very anti-religious, and all of this started in time of so-called Enlightenment time, and there was a very crucial event of French Revolution, and also many other political cultural events which happened in Europe. But all the 19th century, where it was really the start of modernity in Europe and in the West, it was due to these Enlightenment reforms, sometimes very anti-religious. So this is really sometimes very difficult to understand for contemporary Europeans. For example, they are asking why contemporary Muslims are not seeing the human rights, the democracy, and so on in similar view as we see it. The answer sometimes can be simple, because there were not similar processes of enlightenment, and really the society, the politics, and also the role of religion in, for example, in the Middle East, developed very differently from Europe in 19th century. These significant changes in Enlightenment societies started to be, of course, researched by many scientists, most notably probably by German sociologist Max Weber, and he came also with a term disenchantment, or in German Entzauberung, in which he wanted to describe this decrease of mysticism, which was present, for example, in medieval politics and so on, and its transformation into the secular politics. However, on the other side, it doesn't mean that in contemporary Europe or in a contemporary West there is no religion present in politics at all. Of course, for example, we can see the political Catholicism, we can see political Protestantism, for example, in the United States, many Christian democratic parties in Europe, and so on. It's also possible to say that the Enlightenment didn't mean the end of the religion in politics, but the very significant transformation of its role. Of course, there was a very strong decrease of religious influence, for example, of influence of Pope and of many other religious authorities, but the role of religion transformed in politics, transformed into very modern forms. So on this slide you can see how these various Enlightenment reforms were implemented in Europe. In course of French Revolution, it was sometimes very radical, and for example, even the anti-religious movement in France led, for example, to the new deistic cult of so-called supreme being. You will see some interesting pictures on the next slide. It was too radical, and finally, after the French Revolution, when the Napoleon came to power, it was banned. This similar atheist or deistic cults. In later decades, for example, in unified Germany, there is a very famous term, Kulturkampf, which were the policies of Chancellor Bismarck, which wanted to limit the power of Pope. What happened here in a territory where I live? We were the part of the Austrian Empire, And here it was not the revolutionary movement from the society, but there was a very influential emperor, Joseph the Second, the son of Maria Theresia, and he introduced really very important reforms. His period of time was called so-called Enlightenment absolutism. So this is also interesting how these various reforms, sometimes very anti-religious, came from different sources in a society in Europe of 18th and 19th century. Okay, and here we have some illustrated pictures. On the top left, you can see this huge festival of deistic cult of suffering being in Robespierre's revolutionary France at the end of 18th century. On the right, there is a picture of German Chancellor Bismarck playing patiently chess with Roman Pope, which was some kind of allegory of his Kulturkampf. And below on the Belgian stamp, you can see the mentioned Emperor Joseph II, and on the right there is this very famous edict of tolerance, which was really like the beginning of the religious freedom in Austrian Empire at the end of 18th century. And now let's move to the contemporary time and let's look how really the relationship between the religion and politics looks now in various Western states. Even we say that, for example, there are like the Western style of democracies with various differences between it. It doesn't mean that there is no significant differences in the relationship between the religion and politics. In every state it's a little bit different, and it's also very dependent on how history developed on the particular territory and so on. But I think we can say that we have like the two basic models of a relationship between the religion and politics. The first is called so-called civic or civil religion in states like United States of America, partly also Israel, and maybe some other countries. And on the other hand, the more known model probably in Europe would be the so-called state secularism, which is very based on the French understanding of the relationship between the religion and politics. And this is also, we can find it in many other countries, for example in Belgium, which was traditionally under strong influence of France, or in a Canadian province, Quebec, but also in Mexico or in states like Turkey, which is maybe not now the so strong case. But if we look at the ideas of first Turkish president Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his very strong secularization of the Turkish society, it was very obviously inspired by the French model. But now the current situation in Turkey changed, partly due to the policies of current President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And also we have countries where we have mixes of these two basic concepts of relationship between religion and politics. And I think this is, for example, my country, the Czech Republic, but this is also Germany and so on. There we can find elements of both of civil religion, but also of state secularism. There is usually no such a strong separation between the state and the churches, like is it in France and so on and so on. Let's look first at this French model of state secularism, which was very influenced by the ideas of French Revolution, but in not so radical form, like it was in its core, what I mentioned before. But all of these important laws of secularization of France, they were implemented by the French Parliament, especially in at the end of 19th century and in the beginning of 20th century. And now in contemporary France, we have at least officially, very strong division between state and politics, and there is also a economic independence between them. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that French Catholic Church or the French Muslims and so on, doesn't mean that they are oppressed. They have still very strong voice in the society. But this division is very aimed at this economic interconnection between state and religion, and also the state officially wants its state institutions, state schools, and so on to be very secularized. So maybe you remember there were some important causes in recent decade concerning, for example, to religious veiling in state school, which was in many cases it was banned, and the result of it was that these students from state schools which wanted to wear their various religious scarves, yarmulkas, crosses, and so on, they left those state schools and they started to study at private schools, usually connected in some way with the religious community. And of course, this could lead to the problems with the integration of those people, because also the curriculum in these more religious schools was partly different than in the state schools and so on. So really this approaches sometimes also created probably the contradictive results. Okay, and so let's look at this American model of so-called civil or civic religion. This term was coined by American sociologist Robert Belach at the end of the 60s. And he looked how really this interconnection between religion and politics is working in the United States. Of course, there is a lot of mythology about the America as to be a land of the free and so on, and the biggest democracy in the world. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that United States are 100% secular state, and many Americans, the very significant majority of the Americans are religious people. Very often they are Christians. Traditionally, it was a very strong branches of Protestantism in United States, but also growing role of the Catholicism. Sometimes it was also some kind of clash between the Catholicism and Protestantism in the United States, sometimes even very radical, and as it was, for example, misused by movements like was Ku Klux Klan and so on. But now let's move to these basic elements of relationship between the religion and politics, and of even the American Constitution protects you to be part of any religious group and protects your faith, or protects you if you don't want to be part of any religious group. It doesn't mean that there is such a strong division between the state and the politics, like for example is in the France. And just to give you some example, for example, American president is usually, for example, when he has some important speech, so at the end he says the God help the United States and so on. For example, this cannot happen in France. Otherwise, it will be a very big problem for French president. But on the other hand, in the United States, if American president is not mentioning the faith, especially the Christianity, it can be a very big problem for him, or the problem for him to be elected, and so on. So, for example, even this definitely, for example, about Donald Trump, we cannot say that he's a very religious personality, or even vice versa. But on the other hand, he knows that he has to behave in some way for some groups of his voters. For example, this very we can say even fundamentalist voters in the south of the United States and so on. So really there is a the relationship between the state and politics is much more complicated than in France, and it's much more complex, and there is a sometimes very strong very strong interconnection in many ways in the schools. For example, the teaching about human evolution and so on, it's very quite often it's with attacked by religious fundamentalists and so on. It's very different in each American state. So this really makes United States very interesting from this point of view. But what's on the other hand, the basic thing is that you officially you cannot be forced to be a member of any religion, or you cannot be persecuted for being part of some religious group, and vice versa. But on the other hand, we have really various problems connected with this very strong, very complex relationship between the religion and politics in American society. In previous slide, I mentioned this term fundamentalism, which is even very overused by contemporary journalists, and all of these terms like extremist, radicals, terrorists, and so on. They are so widely used, but sometimes I think I have suspicion that these journalists are a little bit lacking the knowledge about really what these terms, what was their meaning. And for example, this term fundamentalism, extremism, terrorism is very often interconnected. But if we look how these terms developed and what are really their meaning, it's very different from this common understanding of this term. How is it interpreted today? So really, for example, this term fundamentalism, originally it didn't have any negative meaning. I will show also in next slide. But the fundamentalism essentially mean that you are faithful to the fundamentals of your faith. It was also on the beginning. It was strongly connected with the Protestant Christianity, and it was meant positively by these Protestants, and they wanted to show that how religious they are, how good they are. But as these terms were used by the journalists, and as the discussions began about Islam and about the radicalization of Islam and about the new radical or about the new fundamentalist groups, really it started to be very chaotic, the using of these terms. So it's often lost its original, unfortunately, it has lost its original meaning, and all of these terms they turn to be just to be some synonym of something which is dangerous, something what is negative, and so on. And what is also important in contemporary discussions is how the religion is represented in public discussion, in informing about it, and so on. And yes, the ordinary people, they don't have time to study the book about the religions. They don't have time to study spiritual texts and so on. So they are just interested. They read tabloids, they read the newspapers, and yeah, we know what these newspapers are usually writing about terrorism, about religious radicalism, about suicide bombing, and so on. And yeah, this is what is selling these newspapers, these sometimes these books, and so on. And yes, the people, I can understand it, but this is very problematic. But because due to this popularity of social networks and so on, everybody's saying his opinion about it, and sometimes it's really these discussions are becoming very aggressive, because the people they just see this distorted image of religions, the pedophile monks in Christianity, the religious fanatics and terrorists in the case of Islam, the religious settlers, fanatics, for example, in Israel, or Hindu fanaticism in India, and so on. But usually these majority majority approach to this religion is much more peaceful. It's very connected with everyday life and so on. But this is not what is selling these newspapers. So unfortunately, the contemporary people are very strongly influenced by these various scandalous events, or very negative events connected with religions. Yeah, this is what I mentioned. The one interesting picture connected with this term fundamentalism. I took this picture in some place in Ohio in, I think, 2014. You can see that there is a Baptist church, and on the sign you can see they are independent and they are fundamental. So of course they don't want to say we are fundamentalists, we are crazy Christian fanatics and so on, but we are really the good Christians. We are obeying the fundaments of our religion. So this is telling something about the origin of this term, and this can be also connected with other religions like Islam, like Judaism, Hinduism, and so on. It doesn't mean if you are fundamentalists, you don't have to be radical. But of course, sometimes in case of some groups, some radicalized Salafi groups, for example, we can say that the Salafis are Islamist fundamentalists. But it doesn't mean that most of the Salafis, they are not political radicals. They are not interested in politics at all. Only what they care about is their religion and how to live as a good Muslims, sometimes in a very strict conditions. But some streams of Salafism, they get politicized, and they get combined with terror methods and with some interpretation of theology and so on, and then we have so-called Salafi jihadists. So, for example, in this case, we can speak about this connection between the fundamentalism and political radicalism. Just to mention some contemporary books dealing with these topics of fundamentalism and of politicization of religion and so on. Of course, there are hundreds of very nice books published especially in English, but many nice books are published in French and in other languages. Especially this French political scientists and Orientalists and so on. They have very interesting texts and books. For me particularly, it was very important, the book from French Orientalist Gilles Kepel, which was called The Revenge of God, the Resurgence of Islam, Christianity and Judaism in the modern world. This is it's not very new book. It's almost 30 years old, but I think it was one of the first books which compared these tendencies in not just it was not just focusing on one religion. But that time it was the religious extremism in Islam started to be very known in the West, but it was far before the September 11th and so on. But this book really put context between the development of big world religions. In case of this book, it was Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Abrahamic religions, and as they are reacting to modernity, to secularization, and to its failures in 20th century, and that in all of these particular religion we can find very similar tendency of so-called neo-fundamentalism, or even political radicalization, politicization, and so on. So really, this was like from my point of view, it was very important research of this topic. And as we are almost at the end, let me just very briefly speak about my country where I was born, the Czech Republic, particularly from point of view of our interest, it's important case of to study, because we are really the island of secularism in Europe, which is not so religious, but much more religious than the Czech Republic. We can guess what were the reasons for it. It was, of course, it was a long time of communist ideology and of this quasi-socialist, quasi-communist regime here for 40 years. Before it was it was like 7 years of fascism and so on. There was also like Czech nationalism when the Czechoslovakia was born. The Czech nationalism was not very sympathetic to Catholicism, because Catholicism was the religion of the Austro-Hungary, the state which Czechoslovakia destroyed partly, and so on. So there are really many reasons why we are so secular and so on. So just on this map on the left, which is also, this is not very up to date, but we can very clearly see the development and secularization of Czech society. As in this year, it was very short, 2 years after the fall of communism, but still a very significant part of, for example, people living in Moravia, which is the region where I live, were very, at least officially, they were baptized and they were member of the Catholic Church. They had it in the birth certificate and so on. And we can see as this old generation of people who were born, for example, even still in the time of Austro-Hungary or this first Czechoslovak Republic between the two wars and so on, most of them, they were baptized and they were at least officially religious. But this is very strongly, this tendency is very strongly decreasing as this generations of people is passing away, and there is no new important religious revival. But still, even now, even this is not 100% up-to-date map, we can see still the big differences, for example, between some parts of Czech Republic, as this is Moravia, traditionally much more Catholic than like the Bohemia and Prague, which was usually the center of the Czech nationalism and so on. And this is the town Brno where I live, and it was originally much more, much strongly connected to Vienna and its structures and so on. So still, we can see that there are still traces of this historic differences. And on this graph, this blue, almost 60%, probably now it will be even more. Inhabitants of Czech Republic, they are saying that they are not religious at all. They are not part of any religious group or church. This let's say 1/4 of population, they are the Roman Catholics, and some other few persons, they are members of other religious groups, like some Protestant groups. Some of them even very modern, which were established after creation of Czechoslovakia and so on. But more or less the Czech society is really very secure. Yeah, this is the last slide, fortunately. This is showing how religion is creating the political conflicts in society. The conflict lines, also called cleavages, political cleavages, which is the political science term, and how these differences inside religions or between religious groups are creating political discourses or political groups, political movements, and so on. Sometimes it's on the level of parliamentary politics, but sometimes it can also lead to very violent conflicts, as we can, for example, now there is a very strong Sunni Shia conflict between these Muslim groups. Of course, it's very politicized term. For example, 20-30 years ago, it was not an issue at all to speak about the Sunni Shia conflict. But now we see revival of this, and this is really very misused by some states like Saudi Arabia or Iran or so on, and it's used for their political purposes. It's also as the Christianity, Protestantism and Catholicism is very strong part of identity of people in Northern Ireland, and for many decades it was a very strong factor of conflict, for example, in this part of Europe and so on. And we can find many other places also in Israel. Religion and religious differences between Jews play very important role, and so on. So this is also quite interesting topic to study. And now we are really in the very end of my presentations. I'm sorry for my mistakes. I'm also sorry I'm not a native speaker, so forgive me my accent, my Czech English. But I did my best. You can also find my blog. You can see this is this Blízký východ blogspot.com. Blízký východ means Middle East, but in Czech language. But there are also some English articles, also many pictures. If you are interested, you can just comment these presentations below here on YouTube. If you will be interested more, I can also prepare some other continuation of these topics, or the topics I'm dealing with in my lecturing to my students and so on. I can prepare for you some overviews of these interesting topics. Yeah, so okay, also you can send me an email if you are interested, and you will also find me on social networks. I have also this account on Facebook. You can write me there. I think I also have some Instagram account, but I'm not using it so much, and so on. So anyway, if you are interested, if you like it in some way, I'm very happy, and maybe we will see each other in some other lecture. So see you. Bye bye.